Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this second day of our Wyeth Foundation for American Art Symposium at the National Gallery on the topic of the African American art world in 20th century Washington, D.C. My job really is just to present Ruth Fine, who is going to have a discussion with the artist this morning, and really she genuinely needs no introduction in this space, having served as curator of modern prints at the gallery from 1980 to 2002, and then for the next decade as curator of special projects in modern art, in which role she presented many exhibitions, including the memorable Romare Bearden exhibition and also the work of Georgia O'Keeffe. I think we just want to mention with great pride the fact that last year her catalog and exhibition procession, The Art of Norman Lewis, was honored by the College Art Association with the Alfred Barr Award for the best catalog of the year. And congratulations to Ruth for that. Thank you. So Ruth, it's over to Ruth Fine. Thank you.
It's really great to be here, and everybody's name's in front of them, so I don't think I need to tell you about them, and those, or tell you who they are. But in thinking about this last night, in addition to wanting to say it's wonderful to be back here with so many people I love in a space that I love, it's also quite a privilege to be on this stage with this incredible group of esteemed artists. I sent this program to a collector friend in New York, and he wrote back to me, "Whoa, that's a talent-heavy panel." And he was really sorry he couldn't be here. And I'm not going to give you any individual bios because you have them, but it did seem to me that it would be useful to kind of give an overview of the mass of talent that's here. So I just wanted to go through a few things that I was thinking about last night. That these artists not only have participated in hundreds, if not thousands, of solo and group exhibitions, and I suspect if anybody really did a careful look, they would find out that it was thousands. They also have taught in public schools and universities to keep art alive for younger generations of students, but also served as arts department deans and other art administrations. They've written texts and articles on art and art history, as well as art criticism, founded important conferences on art, and received grants from the now threatened National Endowment for the Arts, the MacArthur Foundation, the Ford, Guggenheim, Rockefeller, and Danforth Foundations, and are the recipients of many honorary doctorate degrees and of citations from the D.C. Commission on the Arts and Humanities, the National Medal of the Arts, and the National Humanities Medal. So it really does seem like a talent-heavy group of people indeed, and I'm immensely honored to be at the same table with all of them. The program is going to be that everyone's going to speak briefly. Some will show images, some will not. And then we will have a conversation. I think everybody here knows everybody else, and it really is a privilege for me to be with you. And we're going to start, please, with Lillian Thomas Burwell, whom I had the great pleasure of meeting for the first time yesterday.
Well, good morning. When guidelines were suggested for this panel, it was suggested that we tell of one person, or one piece of art, or one event that made a deep impression on us as artists. Well, indeed, influence is a factor. There's no doubt about that. Can you hear okay? But my perception is that the primary and strongest contribution of African American artists in Washington has been anything and everything except the usual external influences. In my case, trying my best to even avoid them. Indeed, we're rarely taller than the shoulders of those upon whom we stand, but those shoulders have allowed us to see light from a different space. I therefore see our strongest artistic expressions to be those of innovation, quite subjectively and introspectively singular. In other words, not influenced by others, but coming from inside as an expression of the self and of spirit. I see my work particularly to be about the result of a channeling of my convictions, my life experiences, and what I personally am convinced of, made of, and therefore what I express. The art itself is a means of channeling spirit itself, almost always without conscious effort. Now that said, my conviction is that for many of us, it's been our differences, both point of view and of an expression, that's given us the strength witnessed by originality. And most of us may have started with an academic background that formed a firm classical base, but what has morphed is emphatically our own. I've lost my place already. I've felt both negative and positive, and in between seem to automatically present themselves in my work, my feelings about everything. I've also found freedom in the lack of opportunity that a broader acceptance of our people and the connectivity that might have offered. Now, open inclusion not being an accepted factor among the African Americans, not just artists, I experienced no need to conform for established expectations or trends. However, not many choose to blow our trumpets in an empty room, so therefore, I know without question that I want to share my work by communicating with you. It's often there that I feel the sharing of our basic humanitarianism. At one point, a young friend of intelligence and of whose judgment I valued reneged by offering an opinion of my work by saying that she knew me well enough to believe that there was more to me than what she saw in my work. Well, that's when I went underground, avoiding exposure to anything in the art world. I stopped seeing exhibits, and that's when I really learned why the caged bird sings. Even as late as the mid-century, the best minds of the country found huge concentration right here and around Howard University because of their denial as acceptance of faculty at other universities. We were therefore privy to their availability. Artists also thrive in the support of other artists and community. We may well work in the solitude necessary for spirit to enter without distraction, but we're able to maintain that necessity because of our knowledge of the strong community of connections and invisible hands and arms around us. We've worked together to earn so much not otherwise available to us. It's seldom, if ever, simply one person, one piece of anything. We were more like family than anything else. And I'll give you a few examples of how that worked in my life, multi-dimensionally. The first person that had a great effect on me was not just family in the sense of family, but actual family. This is a work of Hilda Wilkinson Brown, who was my mother's eldest sister, also an educator, also an artist, who convinced my parents when I told them I wanted to be an artist that I had not lost my mind completely, but that I should go into art education so that the students could be the patrons that fed me, so that then I would have absolute freedom to work in whatever medium or whatever direction I wanted. That was one of the greatest imaginable gifts because it gave me wings. I've always told my students, find something to support your passion. I say that to you as audience because I really believe we're all artists to some degree. So having that advantage of a blood relationship was a tremendous gift to me at the beginning. But then a very interesting thing happened. Years ago, I visited Houston? No, it was Chicago, when I met a young man who, when I told him about an exhibit that I had curated of Hilda's work, that not only had Hilda taught him, but also his mother, and that was Martin Perrier. Well, there was another bit of family coming into it. There was also, that's a piece of Martin's work. Then this is Alma Thomas's work. Alma and her brother, I don't believe there were any brothers, sisters, and my mother and sisters grew up within 2 blocks of each other, so they knew and supported each other. The part that Alma formed in my family, to me, was that she gave me advice about not being so social and parties, and she talked about how Alonzo Aiden, for example, and James had suggested the same thing to her, that she just concentrate on her work. So here again is family coming together, community support. And then there was sitting, I don't know how we skipped over Sylvia, but this is a piece of Sam's work, who told me the very first time that I met him, he didn't know me from Adam, but suggested that if I was going to be taken seriously as an artist, that I should have my own studio space. I don't know whether he remembers that or not. But all of these are influences that affected my life, and we affected the lives of each other because of the fact that doors were closed in other directions. The result was that it brought us together even more closely. Then there was that Sylvia Snowden, who lived a couple of blocks away from me and got very upset with me one day when she found out that it was her studio assistant who I had called upon to deliver a prescription to me in the middle of the night. I didn't even think I knew Sylvia well that much, but she appeared on my doorstep very upset and said, "I just live 2 blocks away, why didn't you call on me?" There again, extended family operating. Here's a piece of David Driscoll's work, who gave me the tremendous, important imprimatur of his sensitivity in how he wrote in my book, which was about my work, an autobiography of sorts. Then someone that we've lost, only in actual physical presence, but in spirit, Felrath Hines, who was my spirit brother in many ways, who called me almost daily when he knew and respected the fact that I was in my studio working, telling me, expressing feelings that he had about the art world in general, about exclusion or inclusion. How should he be considered as an African-American artist or just as an artist, which is part of what all of us concern ourselves with. But he's the one also that gave me tremendous confidence in my own way of working and seeing. Then there's Martha Jackson Jarvis. We have her here in Washington, D.C., because she was conscripted when I was head of the art department at Duke Ellington School of the Arts to teach ceramics. And she simultaneously affected all of us as artists and as family while she was still working on her additional degree in art. And it goes on and on and on. There's Yvonne Pickering Carter, who's no longer with us. This is one of her pieces. And she took me in physically when I was building another house, as did Renee Stout. I don't know whether they were daughters or sisters or whatever, but we were all family. And this is part and much of everything that we are together. I need to show you another piece of work by Michael Platt, who is a genius with a gift that keeps on giving. He has taken students into his own studio and guided them constantly. He's been a brother and a friend to me with his brilliant ideas. Another piece of Michael Platt's work. I remember when he was at another school, he came to my studio one day when I had done my first freestanding piece of work that was somewhere between painting and sculpture, and said, "Hey, Burwell, can you make a whole room full of these things? I've got an exhibit to curate." And that was the beginning of this, which was my first freestanding painting that took up an entire gallery, so that when you walked into the room, you walked into the painting itself. And the thing, and I mentioned this earlier to somebody, it was the fact that we are an intrinsic part of one humanhood that brought me to unexplained tears when I sat on a bench inside of a one-story, one-room exhibition space in front of 3 huge paintings that looked to me just like uninterrupted black. And it was only until when I left that space and looked at a podium that had a pamphlet on it that I was looking at a Russian Jew's depiction of, does anybody know what I was looking at? Someone else told me that they had the same reaction. It was crucifixion. And that has convinced me that I had not seen flat, empty canvases, but a painting by this guy that made me never again doubt how the power of spirit can be manifested through visual experience. It's certainly given dominance to my determination to continue to learn to allow spirit to rule and to channel, and that's certainly a dominant personal experience. And finally, I do believe that you may well discover that the characteristic most prevalent in the work of African American artists in DC is certainly in large part our originality, our inventiveness, both in contents and in means. It's the visual manifestation of finding a way out of no way, our way. I have to add, this ego does this. We all have some of it. But as I age, and I'm proud to announce how old I am in case you want to know, I was born in the 20s, when physically I wasn't able to continue cutting and carving large shapes out of wood, covering them in canvas and painting them so that they were sculptural painting, I started adding plexiglass shapes, which I cut and then put into an oven until they're malleable enough to add to those pieces. So it's an example of why my own mantra these days is find that life itself is a process of living for possibility. Don't ever give up, just keep on keeping on.
Before we go, you were perfect. Before we go on to Sylvia Snowden, you were talking about Rothko's crucifixion. You didn't mention the name Rothko, so I thought, I don't think so. I didn't hear the name Rothko. So the panels that you were talking about, I think, am I right? It was Rothko's. Okay. So now we are moving on to Sylvia Snowden, please.
Hi, I'm Sylvia Snowden, and I paint pictures. Lillian, I do remember that experience. I do, yeah, I do. For a minute I didn't, but I do now. I graduated from Howard University in 1965. At that time, I was taught by 5 people who really excelled in their choice of expression in art. They excelled, and they also kept at an even temper their desire to educate us, their desire for us to learn. That was instilled in us. Their appreciation and knowledge of art was instilled in us, and it was a very, very pleasant experience for me, a learning, hard experience, but a learning experience. And I'll go through some of the things in a minute. These 5 people not only knew art, but they understood art. A lot of people can say, well, I named this done by that, and this is done by this person, but they don't really know the art, don't know the art. These 5 people did. They knew the art. And they were very, very supportive, very supportive. And all 5 were supportive. It's almost as though we were their children. I'm taking that a bit far, Mr. Driscoll. Anyway, and they really taught us to have pride and take pride in your work. And this is that art is not a game. Art is not, making art is not a game. It's not a simple thing to do, but it's something that you take seriously, that you do seriously. The first person I want to talk about, these are just in alphabetical order, is Lila O. Asher. Lila O. Asher is alive now, and I believe she's in her 90s. She is still printmaking, and she shows in Silver Spring. I had a show recently at AU, and she came to see it. But she taught the life drawing class, which then was 6 hours a week. And I learned a lot about drawing the figure. I'm a figure painter, and I learned a lot about the figure from Lila Asher. And many people who do the figure and are very well known need to take Lila Asher's course. They didn't. You know, there were no mittens, do you understand? All right, now I need to retake it. Don't get me wrong, but I just, okay. See, Lila Asher did what Lila Asher can still do with just the line, the simple line. And it's really, it's beautiful the way she uses the line. And she was very patient. She was very patient. When we had these large newsprint pads, and we had to draw the figure from the model, and my figure would be this large on this huge page. And she would, you know, encourage me gently, you know, to get larger. And I did, and I did. Now let me tell you, she wrote a book, The Men I Have Met in Bed. Now that's tricky, isn't it? But this is what she did. She worked for the USO, and she drew pictures of men, soldiers who were ill, who were in hospital. And that's what she meant, the men I knew in bed. Do you know? But that's why it's so tricky, do you know? It's a beautiful book. It is. All right? And the next person I'm going to talk about is David C. Driscoll. I thought that we had to talk about the history of art here. And I went to the library and I looked up everything I could. David Driscoll is everywhere from 1940, I mean everywhere. And it was a pleasure to read that. And he has been involved with art on all levels since the 40s, all levels. And he realized, as all black people do, realized that we don't have a space to show our work. So instead of just complaining about it, he built a center, the David C. Driscoll Center at the University of Maryland, that shows the work of African American artists and African artists. Mm-hmm. And that's quite a tribute to a man who writes books, who lectures, who is known around the world. And it takes, I have a great deal of pride because I studied with Mr. Driscoll. Now, when you in Toulouse, this is what I remember, and I didn't read this. When you were in Toulouse, you had a book. I remember this for 50 years. You had a book that was, you kept the formula for glazes on ceramic pieces. And for some reason, either it was stolen or lost, but that book was gone. I remember that. And I also remember that you are an expert at color. He understands color. And he taught me things about color that I still remember. Like a formula for flesh is to use white, to use cobalt violet, and cadmium orange. You know what they call flesh? Not me. Okay. Anyway, and also the use of, if you use one color, the use of putting another color, particularly the complement of that color, near that, it expands, and I don't want to use the word this, but it makes it pop. You know, it does. Okay, Mr. Driscoll is extremely supportive. Now, Lois Maylou Jones got me my first job at the Delaware State College, and I had my first show there, and Mr. Driscoll came to it. You don't remember? You do you? Right. He came to it. And he also came to my last show at AU. So that's a lot of support there. Right. And I had Lois Maylou Jones. Lois Maylou Jones used the elements and principles of design drilled into you so much that when I teach, I'll stop now, but when I used to teach, I would use the elements and principles of design to, even with art history, to make people, allow people to see the art. So if you describe a painting in terms of, am I going to okay, okay, all right, okay, no.
Orlando, you just have to do the introduction. Yeah.
This is, yeah, right, James A. Porter. Just a minute. James A. Porter and James Wells, okay? James A. Porter got an award from the National Gallery of Art for being one of 26 educators in the country, for being a good educator. 1965, really? Yeah. Now, do you want me to stop this? But I had so much more to say. But I timed it, too. I timed it. Huh?
We'll come back.
Okay.
All right. It's Floyd.
Thank. I shouldn't have asked you. I should have kept going.
Well, I just stopped you. So now we have Dr. Floyd Coleman, and we're going to have a conversation after this. So all the things that we can't say in the first 3 minutes or 5 minutes, we'll catch up. Come on, Floyd.
I want to thank everyone here at the NGA, Kosovo, at the museum, and of course, Howard University for this fabulous program. And it's an honor for me to be here with these distinguished artists and fantastic individuals that I've known a long time. This painting is by Samuel Farrath Hines, an artist I got to know very well. Lillian talked about Phil a few minutes ago. But from 1987 until he passed in 1993, I had a great deal of contact with Phil. And the last 6 months of his life, I saw him at least every week, if not 2 times a week. And we would spend a lot of time in the studio talking about art, talking about painting and the like. I selected this piece by Samuel Farrath Hines. It's called Midnight Garden. It was painted in 1991. I feel that this work is a virtual portrait of Samuel Farrath Hines. It is a work that showed that he had explored many different idioms. He, of course, in his career had explored various types of abstractions. He dealt with gestural abstraction, biomorphic abstraction. He dealt with lyrical abstraction. He did a wide range of geometric, hard edge type iterations, as well as one image op-inspired works. This work, I feel, also reflects something of his sense of what an artist should be about. Like Sylvia and others have spoken about color, Fell was very much interested in color. He said he wanted to, in a way, speak in color. He would talk about color, space, and design structure. Those were the things that he built his works upon, those things. This piece, Midnight Garden, is also a jazz moment. He was an aficionado of music, especially jazz. I feel that this work is very much like a late 1950s, early 1960s composition by Miles Davis. Fell responded to sound. He knew how to translate sound into color. He explored so many different kinds of abstractions. He was not interested in mimesis, i.e., the imitation of nature, but with investigation, invention, and the creative imagination. I learned about art, I learned about being an artist, and I learned about life during the time that I spent with Samuel Farrath Hines. Thank you.
Sylvia said she wants Floyd's minutes because he didn't take. So our next speaker is David C. Driscoll, and he doesn't have any images, I think, yeah?
No images.
No images.
You don't have to look at me. I guess one of my claims to fame would be that I studied life drawing with Lila Asher before Sylvia did in 1952. I just wanted to say a few words about the Howard experience through James V. Herring, the founder of the art department at Howard University, and James A. Porter, who succeeded him in that position. Now, much has been said about these two gentlemen, but I think Sam would back me up on what I'm about to say in the sense that they had a spirit about them of inclusion, of wanting all of us to understand the true meaning of art, and that it wasn't just something that was academic, that it was communal, that it was something that was spiritual, and that it was something that we should have a lifetime commitment to. Now, they were two different perspectives as to how you would see these people. James Herring was no nonsense, and yet he kind of, he taught by parables and playing around telling you things. I remember the first time I encountered him in Thurkill Hall, where the art department was located at Howard University in the 1950s, was in a painting class, and he came up to me and looked at a painting. I was doing a portrait of a young lady wearing a blue sweater. And without introducing himself to me, I'd heard this cantankerous old man would just say anything and embarrass you and what have you. But he said, you a new art student, right? And I said, yes. And he said, well, I'm looking at that painting you're doing. And he looked at the arm of the young lady who was wearing a blue sweater. He said, you'll never paint a better seascape in your whole life. that was my introduction, really, to James V. Herring. Now, when we were in his class and we wanted to really get even with him, and that was often, we would call his entire name, Professor James Vernon Lee Alphonsus Joseph Augustus Herring. And he didn't like that. That was our comeback. Now, in contrast to James A. Porter, James Amos Porter, well, they were all the Howard University people in those days. Their whole deportment was you must dress well, you must speak well, you must act well. And all of that was a part of the whole atmosphere of art. But Professor Porter kind of dressed like an Englishman. You know, he was never there without cufflinks and tie and the pen and, you know, all of that. And yet he taught. But when his introduction in Thurkill Hall to me, and I was in a drawing class in Professor Wells' class in 1951, and he stood behind me and watched me draw for a moment, and then he said, what is your name? And I told him. He said, well, I don't think I know you're an art major. And I said, no, I'm a history major. And he looked at my drawing, and he said, well, you don't belong over there, you belong here. So I went and changed my major. So that was my introduction to Porter. And he then became my mentor. And I thought, well, I'm going to be this painter and change the outlook of the world. I'm going to be a social commentary artist. In the summer of 1953, I went up to Skowhegan. I had Jack Levine as my teacher, and Jack Levine being a social commentary artist, I said, well, I'm going to change the world by showing them, you know, that I can be a critic, I can do this, that, and so. Well, that didn't last very long, but and I came back, and Porter said, we have a new person on the faculty, and I want you to take a class with him. And by that time, Porter was chairman of the department. Herring was retiring. And I said, who is this person? He said, Morris Lewis. Now, Morris, of course, was very quiet. He was just entering into that period of getting involved with the stripes and the strips of painting and what have you. Didn't speak very much. He just encouraged you, if you drew a line on there with color and placed another line against it, he would encourage you. And I said, I don't want to study with this man. I'm going to be a social realist. And Porter said, no, you will be studying with him. And of course I did. Well, there were these different levels. And of course, as Sylvia said, there was Lois, who was no nonsense when it came to learning color, design, theories of art, etc. And of course, Professor Wells, who was so kind, you kind of walk over him if you know, because he just kind of let you move along. But then he'd say, no, that's not the way it's done. So you learn from these people. But I wanted to say all of that to say that Howard had an atmosphere about it of encouragement of the arts, and it was communal in the sense of the universe in Washington. Everybody knew, and they knew everybody. I met Mr. Duncan Phillips through Professor Herring at the Bonnet Aiden Gallery in 1952 when I was working there. I mean, you got a chance to meet people. I met Langston Hughes there at the Bonnet Aiden Gallery, and Romare Bearden and people like that. So they had a sense of community which was beyond Washington, and they tried to introduce you to that, not just in the classroom. And Howard was really at the center of art production in those days. I mean, everybody outside of the Washington community knew about art at Howard University. In the summer, Lois Jones would take students to Paris. Sylvia went with her to Paris. I was too poor to go when I was a student. And I'll end by saying I came to Howard University in 1949, 8 years after this gallery was established. And I say this to the credit of this institution, because we were talking about that at breakfast this morning. This was one of 3 places in Washington, D.C. It was still a segregated city in 1949. This was one of 3 places where African Americans could come and feel at home. They could come and eat in the cafeteria. There were 3 places in Washington where you could eat without the police coming to lock you up. National Gallery of Arts cafeteria, the Methodist Building cafeteria over near the House of Representatives, and the Severing restaurant in the Union Station. And so Washington has changed over the years. The fare on the streetcar at that time was 13 cents. And I came here with the notion that I was going to go to Howard University, even though I hadn't made an application. And I showed up after school had been in session for 3 weeks. And they kind of looked at me strangely. Some of you have heard this story before. And I had my report card. I was class salutatorian in my little 4-room segregated high school in Appalachian, Western North Carolina. And they were like, okay, school has been in session 3 weeks. You can't just walk in and go to college. And had no money and anything. And I said, but what do I need? And they said, well, you've got to make an application. I said, I'm here, give me one. And so we went through this thing of how I got into college. When I got there, and went through this thing about becoming a historian and eventually an artist, one of the things that changed my perspective on how I would look at art and eventually at the world was to go to Rankin Chapel, where the old art gallery had been. Now, they had moved into Founders Library by the time I got there. But I went to chapel one Sunday morning, and Dr. Howard Thurman was speaking. And I think I got religion. I had had it all the time because my father was a Baptist preacher. And, PKs, and all that. Anyway, he based his sermon on service and dedication to your craft, what it is that you do. And he advised us there in the audience. He said, some of your parents have labored to get you here to work so that you would have this opportunity. And he said, you were up all night partying, not studying, not doing the thing that you should be doing. He said, but let me tell you something. He said, if you are one of those students, he said, go thine own way and do thine own thing, so God won't have to forgive you for being born. And that kind of shook me up. I took my art more seriously thereafter. I became a scholarship student, and these same teachers that Sylvia talked about, James Wells, Lila Asher, James Porter, Lois Mailou Jones, James V. Herring, they ushered me into a sense of commitment to my artistry, to my crafts. And James Porter said to me, yeah, you're a pretty good painter, but you've got a good mind, so you can't just spend your time painting. You've got to help us define the field. So that's why I felt that I had to pick up the mantle and go forth. Thank you.
Sam Gilliam is our next speaker.
I came to Washington in 1962. I knew that the head of my department at the University of Louisville and the head of the art department at Howard were classmates at Harvard. So through Sterling Brown and a post photographer who knew Sterling Brown, we chose to invite Dr. Porter over for an afternoon of drinks. And I had my sketchbook. I had gone through academic things, but it was just at the beginning that I was about to discover Paul Klee. And I was certain that I was just after military service and graduate school and having taught the 6th grade, that I was ready for success. And that success, in that sense, meant that I would teach college, not the sixth grade. Dr. Porter said, "Well, you're passionate, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, you'll make more money teaching high school." And he was right. I didn't go to Howard, but I was never far from Howard. But more essentially is that I was not very far from those products. I know everybody at this table. But most of all is that when David came back from Fisk and became head of the department at the University of Maryland, almost everyone here whom you know was at the University of Maryland. I met Keith. I knew about Martin. And Lou and I worked together making prints. Lou gave me a test one day and asked me, did I know anything about silk screening? I said, of course. So I filled the screen up with paint. And I said, hand me the squeegee. and I made my mark. And that's like the idea that you're going to play basketball just by putting a basketball in your hand. There are a lot of techniques and a lot of other energies. One of the things is that I did become sort of very close to Tom Downing, who only talked about Morris Louis. But the real event was the time that Kenneth Nolan had his retrospective in Washington at both the Hirshhorn and the Corcoran. And we were standing in line just to greet him. And at the end of the line was Alma Thomas. She was in a wheelchair at that time. And when Ken got in the door, he looked at the end of the line and he started to run. And he ran and spoke first to Alma Thomas. Well, Alma and I were kind of buddies because that she was painting flowers on one side, and she'd switch the paper over, and she'd do these little puzzle parts. But mostly because that she would always invite you by to talk art, because under the kitchen cabinet she had a bottle of Johnny Walker. And sort of in an inward way from the inside, whether knowing Tom, knowing Keith, and knowing the very rapidly exhaling and growing and very famous Martin Perrier, or working with Lou, I always felt that Washington was the best place to be. If for no other reason, for Rock Creek Park. And when my daughter, my middle daughter, was going into medicine, and she was a Rhodes Scholar, and she came back, and her last year, she was to go to Harvard. She said to me, Dad, I think I want to follow in the family tradition. And I said, what's that? She says, I want to be an artist. And I said, ooh. I said, you have two sisters. One wants to be a filmmaker. wants to be an architect. I want to be an artist. We need support. Upon her graduation from medical school and her working in a hospital in Chicago, I visited her at apartment, and she had more African sculpture, more quilts, more color, more photographs. And I said, did I do the wrong thing? But of course, if you're not an artist, be a collector. It's the mistakes that count. And it's also the winning that counts, which comes to kind of diligence, learning, and innocence, which I always say is that I'm a Washington artist because this is where it is. And if I had more time, I could fill it all in. Thank you.
Keith Morrison.
I lived in Washington for, let's see, about 11 years, a little bit, essentially the decade of the 80s. And Sam forgets, I met Sam not in Washington, but in Chicago. In fact, I met Martin in Chicago as well. And I met Sam in Washington. He visited my studio. We spent a lot of time drinking, and I remember driving down the Dan Ryan Expressway like crazy in my silly little sports car. We almost crashed. Sam and another huge artist guy. And when David, whom I've known for so long, was kind enough to invite me to come to the University of Maryland, so it was like a reunion for me. I can't say I was influenced by anyone in Washington, but my life as an artist was very much affected by Washington. And in Washington, I really found a paradigm, a comfortable level to engage myself with the things that I wanted to do. Actually, I had come to Washington long before I moved here. I first came to Washington in 1967 to meet Dr. James Porter. In 1967, I was only a little baby boy then. And Dr. Porter introduced me to Lois Jones, and he wheeled out my crib, and there he introduced me to David. So David and I have been brothers actually since my babyhood. We've been brothers since for 51 years now. But I've never taught at Howard, and I don't believe I've ever even exhibited at Howard, but Howard has been really very important to my grounding as an artist, my finding a better understanding of why I was doing what I did. And the people who have been mentioned here for the last 2 days are people that I have really found very important to me as an artist. James Herring, Dr. Porter, and people have mentioned Alan Locke, and the many exhibitions, the wonderful exhibitions that they did at Howard since the inception of the Howard Gallery in 1925 or whatever, and through today. And when I lived in Washington, I did some work studying the artists of that at Howard and the makers of art and the people they're hiring, Howard and Porter and so on, including David. I was struck by how wide a field they went in looking at art and the kind of exhibitions they had of artists from all over, Theodore Stamos, Irene Rice Pereira. They brought Picasso, Prince and whatever from New York. They brought Matisse. And at first it was tempting to think that they're just simply being, wider integrationists and expanding the art world to find a place for themselves as black people into an integrated world. But as I studied more, I realized they were doing that, but they were also doing something else. they were forging a world vision of art from an African-American perspective. And like Porter went in, he got Candido Portinari from Brazil and showed here. He got Wilson Bagot from Haiti. Somebody mentioned yesterday, Ben Nwanwu got his first U.S. solo show here. And the Harmon Foundation's exhibition, the one they organized of contemporary African art, which they had difficulty placing in New York, as I recall, they brought it here to Howard in 50 or 51. So what the Howard Gallery, what Porter and Herring, and with Locke's ideas as well, did was to create a world view of art from an African-American perspective. And that really stuck with me. You must remember that in the mid-'80s even, the idea of African-American art or black art is still very, very controversial. And we would spend, a lot of people, black people, white people, spend a lot of time debating the merits of that. So to find some grounding as to that was very important for me. And what I found grounding was not in a definition of what the art should look like, but rather a global perspective that included experiences of people of African descent, looking at art worldwide and making a whole composite of it. But I would remiss if I didn't also mention the importance to me of Jeff Donaldson and AfriCobra, which is interesting, because I think in some ways in many ways they followed that tradition. Now, that may seem a little bit odd. I should also point out, of course, that people like Herring and Locke and whatever, they didn't agree on anything probably. And like a lot of brilliant people, they don't necessarily agree, but the composite of their ideas make a lot of energy and create a worldview. Now, Jeff Donaldson was very important to me in that arena as well, and not just Jeff, but the AfriCobra members. I knew the AfriCobra members of the faculty and Jeff from Chicago. In fact, I knew them before they became AfriCobra. I went to school with some of them. And I was, in fact, in one of their formative meetings before they defined themselves as AfriCobra. And one of the interesting things that Jeff and the AfriCobra faculty brought to Howard to augment what Herring and Porter had and Locke had done was to bring in the importance of ideas carried by people who were slaves, people who were not necessarily formally educated, vernacular ideas, ideas of people who've been kind of left out in many ways, and street art, street ideas. In fact, in some ways, they picked up on something Langston Hughes had promoted. We all know, of course, W.B. Du Bois is a great sociologist, and he talked about the talented tenth. And I can't say that Howard really promoted the talented tenth, but really by dint of being in university, you promote ideas of people who are going toward university. But Langston Hughes, in his poetry, always picked up on the vernacular, the ordinary people. And Jeff Donaldson would talk about that we knew that he studied African art, and he studied with Frank Willard at Northwestern, I believe. He got a PhD. But Jeff's focus was in many ways less on the formally accepted African art than the transmittal of ideas of people from African descent. So AfriCobra really did that, and I think it picked up on a Langston Hughes idea to really add to the mix. And I think that was very, very important to me, to understand that. And people looked at people like Jacob Lawrence, and even before that, Horace Pippin in the 40s, and he was included as part of African American art. But I don't think we ever really quite found, at least from my perspective, a full grounding of how their work fit. People talked about them as outsider, especially Pippin, outsider, primitive, whatever it is. But if you look at it from an AfriCobra perspective, it's the ideas of the unschooled people who are part of the African American family, which they brought in. And I think it creates a whole arena of things. What I got from Howard and Barnett Aiden, from David, from other people, was, first of all, a sense of history. And I'm a very history-conscious person. But more than that, they told a story. They were great storytellers. And their vision was a story of people of African descent. And for me, that was very, very important. Thank you so much.
Martin Perrier.
Pardon me for slipping out. I normally, even though speaking is not my forte, I normally can do it, but I was having almost a kind of a anxiety attack, and I had to get out and collect myself. And I think maybe it's from being back in the place that I was born. Maybe it's because I'm back where I started. I was born in Washington. And as many people probably know, Washington is a very transient city. And my family has been here. I'm like a third generation Washingtonian. So I'm really from Washington. But my life as an artist didn't really happen. I never maintained a studio here. After I finished my college years, I moved away and would come back, obviously lots of family here, come back repeatedly to visit family, and also to exhibit in different capacities. But I was a little hesitant because I'm not really, in a certain sense, a Washington artist. I didn't make my career in Washington. As soon as I left college, I just started to travel and lived in different places. I went in the Peace Corps in Sierra Leone, West Africa. Then I studied in Sweden. Then I lived in New Haven for the time I got my graduate degree at Yale. And then I was hired by David Driscoll to go to Fisk University, where I taught for 2 years and got to know David, although I had met David in our undergraduate years at Catholic University. He was a graduate student working on his MFA, and I was an undergraduate, and we first made contact there. So there's lots of history here at this table, even though, like I said, I'm a dubious Washington artist in the sense of somebody who's lived here all these years. But I feel very close to the city. I can echo what David was saying about what Washington offered or the National Gallery especially offered, because I was taken here as a child by my parents, and I was introduced to all the museums on the mall as a very young child, and it's one of the formative influences in my life was to be taken to the National Gallery. And I was young enough when I first came here to be absolutely in awe of all the naked, carved marble statues, statues of people with no clothes. That really, to a little child, that really was one of the strongest memories I have, is suddenly seeing people with no clothes being depicted. That's how young I was. And my parents were very, very encouraging to all of us to just get out of our neighborhood. We grew up in Southwest Washington, the old Southwest, which was urban renewed back in the 50s. And we lived in a block of apartments that at the time we were our neighbors in that apartment block, and the building is still there. A lot of what was around it was raised and new housing built around it, but that building is still there. But they were professional people. There were government employees, teachers, surrounded by pretty rough neighborhoods. And I went to school at Syfax School, which is now a condominium, but it's right next to this big stadium, right off of the South Capitol Street thruway, brand new athletic stadium. That was where I was born and grew up there. So my education as an artist, we were encouraged to sort of talk about an influence or a person or something, and I don't know if I can talk about one single thing. One of my strongest memories is being encouraged by my parents when I was very small. I drew, and they took note of it, and I had had a bachelor uncle who also noted, and he had gone overseas in the army, came back, and had a little touch of Europe, and came back speaking a little French, and he helped my mother. I was one of 7 kids. At the time, I was the oldest, so there weren't 7 to start with. But my parents were not wealthy at all. My father was a postal clerk. My mother was a school teacher. And this uncle, Uncle Emmett, who was dear to me, learned of an art school for children in Washington. And he investigated it, and he took me with some of my drawings to the school. It was in Foggy Bottom, a part of town I had no knowledge of. I was maybe in the 6th grade or so, 5th or 6th grade. He took me there, and this woman, whose name was Cornelia Uditsky, and David and I, we spoke about it because when David was going to Howard, I think you were delivering from youth art supplies and dropping off art supplies at Mrs. Uditsky's school for young people. And so she said he definitely should be coming here. And she made an arrangement that the fees were affordable to my uncle, who paid for my earliest experience taking myself seriously as an artist. And Cornelia Uditsky, I always thought she was some European person or somebody from Eastern Europe because of her name, and also because of the fact that she, atypically for what was the prevailing pattern in the United States, her school was open racially. I mean, I was the only black kid there, but there was no question once I showed my work that she said, he needs to come here, and I would love to work with him. And that was completely a complete aberration to the prevailing attitude at the time in Washington. Like David said, it was a completely segregated city, completely segregated. But she was an extraordinary sort of open door for me. And I think what I got from her most strongly was that she conducted this art school in a way that was so serious. You come in, you get your paints, you go to your easel, you go to work. There's no gossip, chatter, playing. You take your work very seriously. And that was an extremely crucial experience for me. And then later on, when I decided to, actually, I started my college years at the DC Teachers College, 2 years, and that's where I think I had a course with Hilda Brown, and then I also, that was, I think, the first time I had heard of the Barnett Aiden Gallery, and I think shortly after that I met David, because then I transferred to Catholic U, and made your acquaintance, and then I think I met James Porter at an opening at the Alonzo Aiden Gallery once, so I had a little bit of contact with that. And I realized that the Barnett Aiden Gallery was a real cutting-edge gallery in Washington. Very few galleries that were showing what would be called today cutting-edge art. At the time, it was the Washington color field painting. And Kenneth Nolan, who was on the faculty at Catholic U when I was a student there, I never had a course from him, but he was on the faculty there, showed work at Barnett Aiden Gallery. It wasn't simply limited to showing the work of African-American artists. So it was the city is, there's so much complexity to the background of the city that I think is in a way buried. And it's such a good occasion to be able to make these connections and bring these things out. I remember coming back from my Peace Corps years, after having been, and then, because after the Peace Corps in Sierra Leone, I went to Sweden for 2 years to study art at the Academy in Stockholm. And then I came back, I was away for 4 years and came back to Washington and had heard this name. You've got to meet Sam Gilliam. He's the new artist in Washington. So you may not remember that. So that's when I met Sam Gilliam, and we've been in some kind of contact in the years since. But it was just So I've had sort of a hit and run relationship with Washington, but every time I come back, it's been just an amazingly rich and powerful experience, largely because this is where I started. And I live now in upstate New York, have been there for 25 years. Before that, I was 13 years in Chicago, where I met Keith at University of Illinois in Chicago. So, and then it's just a great experience to be back. Thank you.
And Lou Stovall.
I'm trying to learn to speak louder. Okay. When James L. Wells came to Washington from New York City in 1929 to teach printmaking at Howard University, he brought with him some of the dynamic initiatives which caused the Harlem Renaissance to last through history as we know it. Wells was an active artist in Harlem during that period of amazing aesthetic thought and creativity. And later, Wells became my mentor at Howard University in the 1960s. What he brought to Washington was a system of values based upon community input and outreach. Wells involved himself in printmaking as a means to join a world of artists who he identified as a vehicle for his participation. He led workshops with Charles Alston in Harlem, where Jacob Lawrence was a student assistant, and together they shared their knowledge of making art as young men. James Amos Porter hired Wells for Howard University's Fine Art Department. There he joined what became a continuing tradition of young artists striving to infuse a spirit of possibility in this art world. Thinking back to my discussions of possibility with Mr. Wells, I'm amazed to have been part of a tradition of sharing and participation. I did not know at that particular time, when I began making silkscreen prints, that I was continuing the dream of Mr. Wells and his early entrance into printmaking. At Howard, I was exposed to some of the most inclusive thinkers of the time, and in that period, when ambition to succeed prevailed, we came to an understanding. Perhaps the sharing of ideas has always been the path to involvement in the new. Even as I revisit these ideas of how sharing impacted and persuaded young thinkers to get involved in order to work on a higher plane, I cannot help but think of the many creators, such as the 3 Black women, of whom we have only recently learned, who made space travel plausible and who contributed to a larger intelligence in their workplace. Hidden Figures, the film, reminded me of other contributors to a wide range of intelligence, including medicine, science, agriculture, literature, and of course art, and so much more, who have only occasionally come to broader attention over the years. I knew that if I wanted to become a significant silkscreen printmaker that I envisioned in high school, it would mean working with a lot of people and sharing the medium of silkscreen printmaking by learning and sharing. Mr. Wells recognized in my statement of purpose that I was a kindred spirit, in that we both thought of printmaking as our life pursuit. Though he engaged himself with relief printmaking, and I pursued silkscreen, we both embraced craft as our God-given direction. Wells was a master craftsman, continually pushing the limit of existing traditions as he sought to extend the possibilities of the medium to match the challenging demands of his artistic vision. That also became my mantra. In my talks with him, I shared my thoughts to accomplish silkscreen printmaking as the best medium with which to make art, because it had the possibility of clarity, brightness, and the strength of modern art. It was all about making beautiful images, beautiful pieces which could be affordable at a time when it seemed that the ever-increasing prices of art would be out of reach for young collectors. It was necessary, and it has always been necessary, to establish an accessible market. In 1985 and 86, Wells came to my studio to observe and help as I made the silkscreen print of his original painting, Still Life with Violin. Wells was curious about my experiments in liquid mediums of stop out, with which I could replicate brushstrokes. He was impressed with the results of my experimentation and the prints that I made for other artists. Wells and I had become friends, a distinction which I cherished. He came to all of my exhibitions. At that time, there was a growing number of opportunities to exhibit the work of new artists. Small and recently opened commercial galleries were seeking different cutting-edge works of art. Washington was coming into its own as an art market. In 1987, I invited my friends who knew of my work with Mr. Wells to contribute to funds to travel Mr. Wells's exhibition, 60 Years in Art, from the Washington Project of the Arts to the Harlem Studio Museum. Wells had enjoyed a presence in New York early on in his career, but when he came to Washington, teaching at Howard absorbed him. Somehow going full circle by taking his work back to New York City was as important to Mr. Wells as it was to me. We collected over $13,000, all of which went to Mr. Wells for his travel and for packing and shipping and the final return of his exhibition. I was proud of the Washington Project for the Arts, and of course, Director Jock Reynolds for mounting the exhibition and publishing a very meaningful catalog to document the work of a man who was so consummately involved with Washington and whose friendship, scholarship, and art added greatly to the sum of cultural life here. In my own way, I feel that I have come full circle again by serving as a print maker for Mr. Wells, Jacob Lawrence, Elizabeth Catlett, Lois Mailou Jones, David Driscoll, and Sam Gilliam, and so many others who were not directly connected to either Howard University or the Harlem Renaissance, but who benefited from the flow of participation. So many artists who have come through Washington, D.C. contributed to the various periods of significant creativity, like the Washington Color School. Mr. Wells once said that he takes only credit for introducing me to the printmaking medium, but I also credit Mr. Wells for sharing with me his sense of community and the possibilities of participation. As he shared with me, so he touched the artistic community of Washington, D.C. I am grateful to the CASVA here at the National Gallery of Art for bringing this subject and all of us together. And I'd like to ask Linda Grant Wells to give a stand up, because she's thank you all.
What an extraordinary sense of history is up here. I have a lot of questions, but I wonder if you have questions for each other that might expand what you've been talking about here.
I, for one, am very curious about how the other artists feel about what our primary importance and impact on the Washington scene is. I hope that I made the point that my belief is that as innovators and as, what is the other word? Just the beginners of ways of thinking and producing in our art as being, I think about Martin Perrier's work. No one's ever seen anything like that before. It came from Martin, it didn't come from Washington, but he was one of the contributors of the type of thing that I'm talking about. I'm curious about whether you agree with me that that's our greatest contribution, is being inventive, being creative. Responses, please.
Washington is one of the greatest museum cities in the country, and Martin, you grew up here, so.
Yeah. I think of inventiveness as something that's just something that all artists should claim for themselves. I mean, that's what it means, and part of it is in a way inventing yourself. That gives us the.
Do you see that as one of our greatest contributions, though, as a group? And I see it as an example of denial, making the space for something else to happen that's much greater.
Yeah, it's. I don't want to speak for everybody, and I'll say at the outset that when I first was approached about this, I gave a little feedback to the organizers that I had a little bit of an issue with something that was in the title, the African American Art World, and I felt that, and I think I wrote back and said, you know, from the beginning of our presence, Black artists in this country, and I used the example of Joshua Johnson as one of the earliest Black artists who was a portraitist in the 1700s, free Black man who was an extraordinary artist. And I said, in my conception of art, you want to be an artist in the world and not just in the African American art world. And that's one of my strongest feelings. Being an artist gives you an opportunity and, in a sense, a duty to invent. That's what I mean when I say it's inherent in every artist, but it gives you the opportunity and the possibility and the duty to invent. And part of it is inventing yourself, because there's been a denial that we have a history in some ways. I spent yesterday trying to take in as much as I could of the new museum designed by David Adjaye, the National Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture. Quite a mouthful, but and also quite a volume of truth to try to absorb and take in, and it's overwhelming. And I just think that this inventiveness is. I don't know that it's something that Washington has a monopoly on, or Black artists have a monopoly on. I think it's something that humanity needs to embrace more as a goal. I guess I've said enough, but.
Someone else want to pick up on that, Sam?
I mean, who else does draped canvases across spaces but Sam Gilliam? That came out of Sam, it didn't come out of influence.
I think that we learned from David to concentrate on the previous generation, and from Floyd to concentrate on Spiral, and from Ruth, who had a choice of writing about anyone. She chose Roma Bearden. And during that time, I met a person who said, I've been here 8 times. That's more times than some people have gone to see Star Wars. And I think that it is a place, because Jacob Lawrence was here to print for Lou and did perhaps one of his most essential print projects for Lou. I think it takes a very small place with a lot of close contacts, I guess, like the Paris of Cubism. You don't always have that positive aspect that you're doing the right thing, but sometimes you're doing the wrong thing that leads to exactly the right thing. I think now is that I remember particularly Martin. it was during the time that at Yale that the Black Panther flag flew over the architectural building, and classes were scrambled, and people were arguing. He invited Rockne and I to come to Yale to show our slides. And, well, the fight increased because that the concentration was on a writer, mostly Jack Burnham, who taught at Maryland, but also the consensus was just actually Burnham was writing really about magic. And they say that, I think that one of the things that it's not just Washington or New York, it's actually America. And I don't necessarily agree that with the word black art. I really don't. I've always known that there was an ocean, not a pond. And even with Gates now bringing the history of the great eras of African history, you realize what a tremendous past that collectively that people have put together. Donald Trump's budget does not contain art. And that is the essential thing, is that something that have caused all of us to know each other, to respect each other. And I'll tell you, there's some famous people at this table. And there are always inquiries as to who is Feldrich Hines, or there are shows about what comes from Indiana, David Smith, or even the curator of the Indianapolis Museum. When you talk about Feldrich Hines being a color-filled painter, she says, no, he's Feldrich Hines. And that's the thing is that essentially this place, the thinking that comes from this country leads to essential things that are a part of what is called universals. And that's the most important thing. And right now, I find it impossible to be sad because I've gone back to Yale. I see the number of black students. I know that the Calhoun window's gone. I know that Thomas Jefferson's Monticello now has this, they're rebuilding the Sally Hemings room. I've read The State of Jones by Jenkins. I know Houston Conwell, and I know Kinshasa. And I had to inform her this morning that Houston's mother and my mother were good friends. So that collectively, sometimes you're blessed to know people, friendships, and things like this, and live in a good place where there's the Phillips, the Hirshhorn, the National Gallery, and now the new Smithsonian. And Mel Edwards reminded me that Smith means blacksmith. Thank you.
We've been talking about influences, and I can say that I've been influenced by all of these people here. When I look to my far right and I see Lou Stovall, it was in the early 60s when I first met Lou. And he confirmed some of the things that I had read about, particularly about printmaking and James Wells. And also, he confirmed another thing that I had learned from reading James A. Porter's Modern Negro Art and other things by Porter, that Howard was indeed an important place because Lou was a recent MFA graduate of Howard. And then when I looked to my left, I knew of Lillian, and I knew of Sylvia from the 70s forward. I knew their work. And then when I was teaching in Southern Illinois University, because I taught both studio art, I taught graduate painting, as well as contemporary seminars in art history and criticism there. And I talked about the work of Sam Gilliam and Martin Puryear in those classes. And some of my students didn't know who they were, but I said that they belong with all of the other contemporary artists that I'm talking about, whether it may be Lichtenstein or Pollock or whomever, that they were in that category. And I've been saying this since the 70s. I met Sam in 1968 when he gave a brilliant lecture at the Atlanta High Museum. And from that point on, he was part of my seminar discussions that in my contemporary art classes, Howardina Pindell and a lot of others. David Driscoll, I go back to 1956. I was a freshman at Alabama State College, now university. And David was at a little place called Talladega College. And they were writing about, in the white newspaper there, and let's face it, we've lived in an apartheid society in this country, and particularly in the South, a little bit better in the North, but still apartheid, still racism, segregation, and all of those sorts of things. But David in Alabama, in Klan country, David was doing all sorts of things, and they were writing about him in the local white newspapers. They only wrote about black people when they were in jail or had stolen a chicken or something. But they were writing about David. And in I believe it was 1958 or 59, I traveled to Atlanta, Georgia to see an exhibition that the Atlanta University Center had sponsored. It really was Atlanta Life Insurance Company that sponsored it, but it was held at Atlanta University. It was the annual national exhibition of Negro artists. It had paintings, prints, and so forth, and sculptures. And I stood in front of that painting. It was called Young Pines Growing. I remember it, that painting. And I stood there looking at that work. I knew Howard, he was a graduate of Howard, and so forth. So my point here is that Howard University and all of these individuals here, and I got to meet Keith, and all of these individuals I've greatly admired and respected, and I've talked about them in seminars or in some of the conferences that I've tried to sponsor over the years and the like. So without rambling on, and then also I was so pleased to hear about Ruth. Well, I knew of Ruth being given this distinguished award by CAA. CAA recognized the fantastic work that Ruth did for the Norman Lewis exhibition, which was just a fantastic exhibition, and some of you got a chance to see it. And I might also say that we honored Ruth at the Portico Oakland prior to CAA.
And what an honor that was indeed. I have a question, actually. David, you did a book in 1976 on the history of African American art, and I'm wondering what kinds of things you see as having changed since 1976 in terms of how African American art is looked at or included in a broader community.
I always say in my art sermons, which they're very often that more than anything else, that first of all, we didn't ask to be called Negro artists, black artists, or whatever. We just wanted to be artists. But because of the peculiar and very often inhumane, insensitive, sociological nomenclature that is so evident in classifying and naming people in this country, we all but decided, accepted, and became involved with dispensing with this broader definition of humanity and talking about, black artists, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And someday I hope that we will, and I remember that was always the wish of Lois Jones. She said, I'd just like to be called an artist. I'd like to be called an American artist. And hopefully one day that will happen. And I very often get questions as I move around the country. You still doing those black shows? Well, I'm doing shows. I'm often inclined to say, as Talisa Fleming, Dr. Fleming said over at Paris back in January at the symposium there dealing with the Color Line exhibition, she said, I'm just kind of tired of this term black art. And if you're not talking about black paint on the canvas, I don't want to address it anymore. So, we get caught up in so many of those labels out of the character of being named and nomenclature of who we are, et cetera. And I think everybody sitting here today know that you have artists who are of the finest caliber sitting here at this table. And Washington is blessed, as that has been said on numerous occasions, with being a center for this kind of thought, this kind of process in creativity. And I very often say segments of the community have been left out. And this is really, as I approach my 86th birthday, I am delighted to see this happening at our nation's premier gallery and museum. The notion that the Howard University community has made a contribution. And it takes that kind of forward thinking, kind of forward looking, because as Sam mentioned, these are critical times now. If the arts are really in for a shock if we haven't already gotten shocked. And we must stand tall. The divisions, gender, race, et cetera, they are not a part of art. Art is a spiritual definition of who we are. And it gives us the sense of the best that there is in the human spirit. And we must embrace the notion that we are under attack and that we must be willing to make the sacrifices of creative intervention, innovation, whatever is necessary to see to it that the blight of discontent, of unkindness that is before us in the world, in this particular city in general, is not what we spend our time involved with. We must go on with the creative spirit. We must keep on with the sense of keeping on until such time that we are above and beyond all of the nonsense that is attacking us as artists. I don't think I answered your question, but I've decided now at my age I'll say what I want to.
Keith wants to say something, but I think before that I'll say all of us up here at our age should say what we want to. I think we're all in the same category.
Going back to Lillian's question about artists, the character of the artists and the potential of the artists in Washington, I want to try to answer part of it. And when I was in Washington, when I lived in Washington, I was very struck by the fact that so many artists in Washington were not from Washington. Washington was like a watering hole. A lot of people from different places, in fact, around the table. Martin, you're probably the only person here who's actually from Washington. You're from Louisville, you and Muhammad Ali, I think. And so people from all, I'm not even from the United States. Hell, don't tell Donald Trump I have a green card, by the way. My country we're not even privileged enough to be on anybody's list. I think I'm going to propose that Jamaica get on the list. I mean, I think that's a status symbol. I want to be on that damn list, man. But the thing is that I met David and Dr. Porter, Dr. Driscoll Double in 67. And one of the things that struck me, and I was from Jamaica, is that there was no line of demarcation in their thinking between the U.S. and other people of African descent. And I've known David now for 51 years. And I think I said that to you last year. I have never, ever heard David make a distinction about African-American artists, Caribbean artists, African artists. He goes and he sees the whole as a totality. And I think that was in the vision of James Herring and Dr. Porter, and indeed Alain Locke. They had that whole vision of a kind of a global sense. And that global sense included, of course, people of African descent, but everybody else as well. It's how they saw the world from their experiences. And I think Washington, in my experience, in my years here, was a bit like that. There are people from all over who came. Floyd, where are you from? You're from LA. You're from LA. They came from different places and made Washington the strength that it is. At least that was in my experience. Thank you.
I need to add a little bit of preaching to this, I think. We have a tendency in this country to put everything into a category. We have sort of a file cabinet mentality. It's not just in races and occupations, but in thinking. It seems to make things more manageable if you can put someone and something into a category. There's an analogy that I love to use that helps us all in our thinking, whether it's about art or anything else. I see all humanity the way a person would see a giant crystal ball. A diamond cutter cuts one stone into different facets. And I see each of us being a different facet of the same humanity. And light hits us all from a different angle because of that. It doesn't mean that we're separated from each other, but that we have that much more need of each other and that much need to contribute to how other people see and think and are. If we could just sort of use our differences as an additional thing instead of as a way to separate us, then we won't end up with a crystal ball falling as dust to the ground.
I think that we ought to examine what part of European art is African. That's the crux there. And when you examine that, I haven't closely enough, but when you examine that, we're not copying them. We're not. It's the other way around. It's completely the other way around. And I want to say this too about Sam. Sam influenced me. This was a long time ago, I was 19 or 20, and he came to my house. This is when you lived on South Dakota Avenue. And he came to my house, my parents' house, and asked him to look at my work, and he did. I'm a figurative painter. And Sam said that all the figures nude, but Sam says, you can't see the penis. There's no penis. You know, like Cézanne's work. Do you know how the shyness of it? And so it takes, that's common. Anyway, it takes a while to go from being shy of showing the penis to actually painting it. And my penises became large, but they were not pornographic. They're not pornographic. And there's more interest in the space, the negative space around them, than just it itself.
Okay.
No, the way you're looking at me.
We look at everybody.
Too far? No. Oh, I think I said it's time for me to be quiet.
Looks like Lou wants to say something at the end of the table.
I think it's
Yeah?
I think it's important for us to acknowledge our incredible audience, the friendship that has been bestowed upon all the artists here. I certainly feel it. There's something about Washington. There was a spirit of possibility, and it was a spirit of, even though we didn't all feel it all the time, because we did have all these social problems having to do with color and gender and all that. But the fact that you all are here and that you're loving what's going on here, and I think this is one great city, and we have all enjoyed the National Gallery of Art. I'm especially, as I said before, grateful to the CASVA. I mean, imagine being part of advanced, spiritual education. So my friend Elizabeth Cropper, who has put all this together, and her incredible staff, I think we all are very, very fortunate. And hopefully this will go on. As Rusty Powell said last night, he wants this to be a continuation of fellowship and of participation. And I think that's a wonderful thing. So I'm going to say it, that you're all welcome. constantly, and I've always been welcome back to the National Gallery of Art, and don't ever leave it.
Well, that sounds like the perfect ending for the morning. Thank you, Lou. I didn't have to think one up.